Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Ansley Sherman. I'm Muscogee Creek, and I'm the program attorney for the National American Indian Court Judges Association, or NIJA for short, and I'll be moderating today. But before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to our presenter, Judge Kim McGinnis. Judge McGinnis is Chief Judge for the Pueblo of Pojoaque in New Mexico. Judge McGinnis received a PhD in Neuropharmacology from the University of Michigan and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in molecular neurogenetics at Massachusetts General Hospital. She graduated from Boston University School of Law in 2004 and worked primarily as a criminal defense attorney until 2011, when she moved to Taos, New Mexico. The Pueblo of Pojoaque Tribal Council appointed her associate judge in 2013 and chief judge in 2015. Judge McGinnis presides over Pojoaque's Path to Wellness Court, a tribal healing to wellness court. She is also the programmatic director of the recently implemented Sober Housing Program, which coordinates with the Path to Wellness Court to provide structured, sober transitional housing for people struggling with addiction. And with that, I'll hand it over to Judge McGinnis so she can go ahead and get started.
All right, good afternoon, and thanks for participating. I do like to get questions while I'm going along, so if anybody has any questions, just type it in the chat room, and I believe Ansley will interrupt me with questions. So as Ansley said, I do preside over the Path to Wellness Court here in northern New Mexico with the Pueblo Pojoaque, and of course what we're seeing primarily is alcohol addiction and also opioid addiction, are two main drugs that we see up here. And also we're starting to see meth, amphetamine, and other prescription drugs. And I just wanted to give a brief definition of what pharmacology is. Pharmacology basically is the study of drugs and how they affect our system. And I'll be talking kind of in nerdy detail about some pharmacological aspects of the drugs of abuse, just because to give you all a brief introduction to it, obviously I'm not expecting to remember the ins and outs, but just kind of to give a better understanding of why addicts are affected so strongly and why drug addiction is so difficult to overcome. And throughout the talk, when I say drug addiction, I'm also talking about alcohol, because alcohol is definitely a drug of abuse. And in the last year, in 2016, there were over 64,000 overdose deaths in the United States. That's a huge number, more than the number of people killed in the Vietnam War. And, that's over 90 deaths from opioids alone every day last year. 90 people a day were dying from opioid addicts and continue. And the number of deaths continues to rise. So this is a huge problem. I work with addicts every day in court and also in the community, and it's extremely frustrating to work with addicts. It's very difficult. Relapse rates are really high, and it's just incredibly frustrating, and it feels overwhelming sometimes. And as a judge, I don't have direct contact with folks that much. I see them once a week in court, so it's the probation officers, the providers, the substance abuse counselors who are really doing the work on the ground to work with these addicts. And I talk to my team all the time about how frustrated they are and the high burnout level they have. And and so I really want to convey some understanding of why it's so frustrating and why addicts are so hard to deal with and why it's so hard to overcome addiction. So just a few definitional aspects. So a drug of abuse, and this is how I use the term and how a lot of practitioners use the term, it's a drug that's taken for non-medicinal reasons and usually for its mind-altering effects. So again, alcohol is also, when I say drug of abuse, alcohol is also included in there. Now, there's also the terms of drug dependence versus drug addiction. And drug dependence means that and I'll talk about this in greater detail, that your body has adapted to the drug and it relies on a sense to the drug. And if you stop taking the drug, your body has a reaction. You can be dependent on a drug without having negative consequences in your life, such as drug-seeking behavior or drunk driving, those sorts of things that are negative consequences. Drug addiction is the compulsive use of a drug with the harmful consequences, including that drug-seeking behavior and consequences in your life, your social life, your school life, etc. And a lot of times people use the analogy with insulin and diabetes, that you can be dependent on insulin, but you're not addicted to it. You need the insulin to survive. Your body's adapted to using insulin, and you're dependent on it, but you're not. It's not that you're addicted to the insulin. So why do people use mood-altering substances? And you can kind of get this into the chat box too about what's going on if you want to share your thoughts on this. But people use mood-altering substances for lots of different reasons, including feeling good, feeling better, self-medication. Sometimes it's experiment. Sometimes it's to deal with trauma in their lives, and I'll talk a lot about trauma because that's very strongly connected with drug abuse. And so it's people use drugs for many different reasons, mood-altering substances for many different reasons, and people come from all kinds of different backgrounds who become addicted to drugs, and it's across socioeconomic lines, across race lines, across cultural lines. It's in every community. So now, under the new Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, we're on number 5 now, they no longer use the term substance abuse as the clinical definition. Those of us who are not practitioners will still use substance abuse, but practitioners use a substance use disorder, and it's got a certain number of criteria that are required for somebody to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder. So you need evidence of impaired self-control, social impairment, risky use, and pharmacological dependence. And then the substance use disorder, you can have mild, which is moderate, or severe, and depending on the number of diagnostic criteria from these 4 categories that come up. And those diagnostic criteria, there's 10 or 11 on them depending on the drug, but impaired self-control is taking more or for longer than intended of the drug, wanting to stop or cut down on these but not being able to, spending a time obtaining them, that's that drug-seeking behavior, or recovering from using them, and then craving and urges to use the substance. Social impairment is, impaired work, school, continued use because of, in spite of relationship problems, and then giving up important social, occupational, recreational activities because of the substance use. And then under risky use, it's using despite the hazardous situations of like drunk driving or going to bars and blacking out, continuing use despite physical or psychological problems, which are, diabetes can be made worse by alcohol use, anxiety, or other physical problems, blackouts, liver problems, things like that. And then the pharmacologic dependence is tolerance to the effects of the drug. So people have to take more of the substance to get the desired effect. And then also having withdrawal symptoms when they stop using them, which is what we often see with opioid addicts, with the kicking, and then with alcohol addicts who are having sometimes even seizures and hallucinations when they're coming off the alcohol, which is why it's so important to be that they are medically weaned off alcohol and opioids because of the potential for severe withdrawal symptoms, including death. Now, the substance use disorder should not be mistaken for substance-induced disorders, which are, sometimes the hallucinations that can sometimes be seen with certain drugs, the withdrawal effects, the flu-like symptoms. Those are substance-induced disorders, and they're not part of the substance use disorder. The important thing is that is that the drug of abuse has to have a negative impact for a diagnosis of substance use disorder. So again, the analogy of the insulin, the person is dependent on the insulin but not addicted to it. It's not a substance use disorder for somebody to be dependent on insulin. And also people often talk about being addicted to chocolate or coffee. I'm very addicted to coffee, but it doesn't have a negative impact on my life, so it's not a substance use disorder. And chocolate isn't going to be a substance use disorder. And this is also goes for folks who are using medication-assisted treatment, such as methadone or Suboxone. If it doesn't have if the person is using methadone or Suboxone and it's not having a negative impact on their life, then it's not a diagnosable substance use disorder. They may have a substance use disorder that led to them using those prescribed drugs, but it's not, the use of those alone as prescribed is not a substance use disorder. It's just a little overlay. This is the most recent National Survey on Drug Use and Health from 2016. And I just wanted to point out here the age of the substance abuse. So on the left, it's illicit drug use, and on the right, it's binge and heavy alcohol use. And of course, what we see is that the highest rate of use are folks from 18 to 25. And that's who we usually see in our wellness court, is that age range. You know, a lot of people, you know, above 25 become, you know, stop using on their own. And that's really the way most people stop using drugs of abuse is on their own. They outgrow it, they decide they're done with it, and they trail off use of it once they get to be in their late 20s and early 30s. Of course, not everyone does, and there's still significant use, but many people do. But the thing is, we don't know which of those are going to stop on their own and who's going to continue to use. And we see, of course, the people we see are court involved, mostly from drunk driving or for possession of heroin or drug paraphernalia. That's who we see in our court. And we don't know who's going to end up dying from overdoses or who's going to, you know, not get themselves to stop drinking. So we do put them in treatment, everybody in treatment, because you don't know who's going to be able to quit on their own and who's not. So this is the 2015 National Drug Survey on, this is the past year illicit drug use by race and age. So again, you see with the red that that's the 18 to 25 group, which is way higher than the other groups. And also see that American Indian, Native Alaskans have the highest, other than the biracial. And the biracial could be biracial Native American too, have a high rate of drug use. And that's what we see in our community too, of course. And then this is methamphetamine use by race and age. And I had to go back and double and triple check because that's a huge, with American Indians and Native American, Alaska Natives have a much higher rate of methamphetamine use than other races, including biracial folks. And it's a shockingly larger number. In our area, we don't see that much meth use yet. We usually see meth use in conjunction with opioid use. But I know other areas are devastated by meth use. And this is past year opioid use, and I have a typo there. We were just talking about that typo. It's, again, American Indian Native Alaskans have a higher rate of opioid use than other races. And again, it's that 18 to 25 age range where we see the most prevalent use. But these drugs, and particularly opioids, are just devastating communities all across the country, and it's just an alarming death rate of 90 people a day who are dying of overdoses. Relapses and slips, you know, we use the terms relapses and slips. Relapses, I don't think there's a really great clinical definition, but it's just we call it relapse if somebody goes into full-blown use over time and kind of stop complying with court. That's how we use it in our court. And a slip is where somebody uses once, but they come right back and they own up to it. And I like to say slips because as opposed to relapse every time somebody reuses, just because I think it's a more positive way of thinking that somebody made a mistake, but they're coming forward to talk to us and try to get back on track. But it's an extremely high rate. So this is percentage after inpatient treatment. So even after inpatient treatment, the relapse rate is about 90% for opioids and for methamphetamines. So 9 out of 10 people are going to go back to using their drug after inpatient treatment. And that's about 75% relapse rate for alcohol. And with opioid relapse in particular, it's extremely dangerous a time after somebody's been abstinent for a certain period of time. So there's a particular danger of overdose deaths after folks are released from inpatient treatment or jail. That's where we see, the deaths or the overdose rates. And we just had a young man die last month of an overdose after he'd been in jail from another jurisdiction, and he was released and he overdosed within 2 days. So just to keep that in mind, if somebody's coming out of jail, that you really need to be wary that that might be a time where they may overdose because they're going to go back to using the same dose they used before they went into jail or rehab when they relapse. This is from a New York Times study recently showing the drug-involved deaths in the U.S. over time. And what it shows is that fentanyl, which is an opioid, is becoming the most prevalent drug associated with overdose deaths, and fentanyl analogs, which include carfentanil. So fentanyl is a drug that's made in a factory. It's not from poppies. It's made commercially it's originally intended for pain relief for cancer patients, and the fentanyl analogs are also used to sedate and for pain relief for large animals like elephants. And these are 40 to 10,000 times more potent than heroin. And they're being manufactured in China and Mexico and brought up. And we're seeing a lot of it now in New Mexico. And deaths from fentanyl and the fentanyl analogs have highly surpassed heroin and other drugs. So we do have a poll question now. We just want to see what drugs are most prevalent in your community, and I believe you can vote for more than one. So go ahead and take a few minutes to do that poll question. We're seeing a lot of meth. So about a lot of meth, heroin, prescription opioids. But yeah, I guess that's about what we would expect. And we didn't have alcohol on here because I assume that would be 100%. But the prevalence of the fentanyl is something to really watch out for. Our officers just found 3,000 pills that ended up being fentanyl, and they were they were made to look like OxyContin pills. So they looked like OxyContin pills, but they were actually fentanyl. So if somebody thinks they're taking OxyContin, but they're really taking fentanyl, it's going to be extremely dangerous. And it's also extremely dangerous for law enforcement because the fentanyl can be inhaled, and it will have major detrimental effects to the officers, so they need to be super careful when they're dealing with any kind of thing that they may believe is an opioid. So this slide kind of shows the devastation in the community of the deaths, but of course, this is the number of the deaths, but many, many, many more people are addicted and dealing with addiction and its effects on their families, on the community, on their ability to work, their ability to go to school. And the basis of my talk is going to be to try to discuss why can't addicts get it together. And I know that's not a very compassionate way of putting it, because you really want to look at it from a more trauma-informed place of what happened to these addicts that they're behave the way they do, what's going on for them, and what's going on in their brain. And when I talked about why can't addicts get it together, I'm talking about why can't they be on time? It's so frustrating for our practitioners, our service providers, because people just blow off meetings, so even if you remind them, or even with our wellness court, we have it at the same time every week, every Tuesday at 2, and it's remarkable that folks, show up at 2:45, show up at 3, or don't show up at all. And at the beginning, of course, we work with them a lot about timing, about reminding themselves, about figuring out how to get to places on time. But it is just super frustrating, that they can't get it together. And so we're going to talk about what's going on in their brains of addicts and why their brain is leading them down this road of not actually being able to get it together until they've been in recovery for a good while. So this is kind of a reflection of the rational brain versus the addict brain. So you see the stop area. The stop is the prefrontal cortex. That's the thinking part of the brain. That's the rational brain. That's where your brain is making decisions based on what may happen in the future. I'm sure many of you have heard about in juveniles how the prefrontal cortex isn't developed. Well, in men, it's not developed until about the age of 25, which is also the age that many people stop abusing drugs. And that's the part of the brain that allows people to see consequences. And what happens in addiction is that that part of the brain is basically damaged, turned off, and not accessible. And the area where the go is, this is the area, it's called the limbic system. It's kind of the go brain. And we call it the addict brain in the court, where it's hard for folks to make decisions. It takes over the rational brain. It's when you have that first drink and you can't stop drinking. It has low impulse control because the executive functions of the prefrontal cortex aren't present. And so the person instinctually is going to do the drug thinking without thinking. So the limbic brain, the feeling brain, takes over from the thinking brain. And there's a lot of research been done on what determines whether a person becomes addicted and what that is. And we do have a survey of what you all think is the most important factor in determining whether somebody becomes addicted. And this is something that's being refined all the time. As scientists were always, and I still consider myself a scientist even though it's been a number of years since I've actually done any work in a lab. But we're always contradicting past studies or refining studies. And the one thing that's definitely been shown to be connected to addiction is genetics. I don't drink at all. My father was an alcoholic, and I chose not to even start drinking because I was worried about my genes. And what's been found is that it is inheritable. It's never been shown, particularly in any particular ethnicity or race, there's a lot of talk about Native Americans having the gene, but it's never been shown that it's more prevalent among Native Americans than among other races or ethnicities. A lot of people who end up becoming addicted have impulsivity problems as children even. A lot of folks who are addicted, of course, have trauma in their backgrounds, and we'll talk more about that. A lot of people have very stressful lives or are anxious, or with mental illness, there's a lot of co-occurring disorders. And so there's some self-medication that happens. And we see that a lot with marijuana use, where people are using it as an anxiolytic, something to help with their anxiety. And, New Mexico does have medical marijuana, and many states do now have medical marijuana. We struggle with that in our drug court, but we do permit marijuana use in our drug court if it is prescribed by a physician. And, the reasons of why people become addicts, I think, for me, I think it comes down a lot to trauma, having trauma in the past, and that's something that a lot of wellness courts don't do a great job of addressing. And our wellness court certainly could do a way better job of addressing, and we're trying to address that better and get folks to get some service providers to help them with their trauma backgrounds, and just being more aware for our folks who work with us to deal with the folks coming in who are mostly going to be have a huge trauma background. So this is the big picture of the brain. The brain, the front part, as I already said, where the cerebrum is, that's the frontal cortex. That's the thinking part of the brain. That's called the executive function, where decision-making is made and impulse control. And that's the part that's not well developed in juveniles, and it's certainly not well developed in addicts, especially if the addicts started using when they were juveniles, which many, if not most, of the folks we deal with have. The temporal lobe, which is the red area in this drawing, is where behavior center, memory, emotions, and we'll talk about that in detail because that's the part that gets taken over by the drug. At the base of the brain, this area here is the brain stem. That's where the breathing, so it's the automatic response is breathing and heartbeat, and that's what the opioids will affect that and shut that down if there's an overdose, and that's why people die of overdoses from opioids. So the next, we're going to talk about at the more molecular level, the smaller level. These are the synapses. So this is where all the pharmacological action happens. And on the left is a drawing of a synaptic cleft. This is what they look like in a slide over here. I did a lot of this work when I was a scientist of looking at what's going on in a slide. So these are neurons actually grown and died. So this is what they look like with their synapses and that's the cell body, and then the dendrites reach out. And then over here, these little blobs are representative of dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is the key factor in addiction. That's where the action is. And the dopamine binds to dopamine receptors, which are represented here. And they create a lot of effects in the downstream area, and we'll talk about that. And the important thing is that different drugs have different effects at this level. They bind to different receptors. They have dopamine release in different ways. And so for people who don't understand this, it's always confusing about why is a cocaine addict, why do people like cocaine versus liking opioids versus liking methamphetamine versus alcohol? And some people like all of them, of course, but sometimes we talk about folks' drugs of choice. And people have drugs of choice in part because each drug has a different mechanism of action, a different way of creating the desired effect. And that also means that each drug has a different treatment a different effect on the person, and it need to be treated in slightly different ways, if not major ways. And it all comes down to this reward pathway. The reward pathway it's also called the pleasure center, and it's a survival mechanism, and it was evolved because to show that, when we eat, it gives us pleasure. When we drink cold water when we're thirsty, we get pleasure. So things that are important for survival are keyed by a feeling of pleasure. And so our body says, yes, that's great. We need to keep doing that. So we need to drink. We need to have sex. We need to eat when we're hungry. And that marks what is important. What happens in addiction is that gets taken over by the drug, which creates, so the drugs of abuse create that same feeling of pleasure. And so our brain marks that as something that's really important for survival. And so the pleasure center is down here with the nucleus accumbens. And it all starts here. This is the VTA, which is the ventral tegmental area. And that releases a bunch of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens. It also releases dopamine into the frontal cortex. And in normal eating and drinking, it's not that big of an effect. It's just an effect to say, oh, yeah, that's good. We need to keep doing that. With drugs, there's a huge release of dopamine, way bigger than normal release for drugs, for food or water. And so that creates these strong memories. So the hippocampus, which is here, is where memories are stored. And then also the amygdala, which is also in the same area, creates emotions. So what happens is a person takes the drug and your brain is going to remember that feeling, remember where you were, what you were smelling, what you were hearing when you took the drug, and the amygdala is going to mark the feelings, the great feelings that you had at that time and place. And the amygdala is the center of the conditioned response for drug seeking. This slide represents the spike in dopamine in the nucleus accumbens after a drug. It's a huge increase that creates this intense pleasure, and that intense pleasure with the drug of abuse occurs at the beginning, and then it starts getting less and less, which is why folks have to start using more and more drug to get the same feeling. And eventually they never really get that feeling. They can never get that same feeling back, but they have to keep using the drug because then their body becomes dependent on it, or they'll go through withdrawal if they stop using it. So that spike is the pleasure signal. And the closer the injection or the intake of the drug is with that spike in dopamine is what creates the association and the addiction. So if your brain knows to associate the injection of a drug with the dopamine spike, then you'll become addicted quicker. It's more of an association. And so you know that there's different ways of taking in a drug. And ingestion is the slowest way. So taking pills, it takes quite a while for it to get to the brain because it has to be digested. It has to get into your your bloodstream and then go to the brain from your digestive system. So many drug companies have created these extended release opioids, such as Opana and other extended release, where when you take it in, it takes a really long time to digest. And so the thought was that would make it hard for people to become addicted to it. But of course, addicts are very clever. So first folks started crushing them, and then they figured out how to basically dissolve out the opioid from the Opana so they could inject it and then, or smoke it, and then it becomes a perfect drug of abuse. Snorting is the third fastest way of getting it in. It's absorbed through the membranes. Injection, it goes directly into the veins, and then it goes through the lungs to the artery to the brain. And smoking it is generally the quickest way of getting high, and it's the quickest way of developing an addiction. Smoking nicotine, smoking crack, smoking heroin, it gets to the lungs immediately and then to the artery to the brain very quickly. So there's an immediate sensation of getting high pretty much from smoking. And it's milliseconds difference perhaps between smoking and ejecting, but that milliseconds is important in creating the addiction. And we have many folks who have gotten a prescription for an opioid, a legal prescription, and then they're smoking it. You find our police find the tinfoil with the burnt residue, and I'm sure you've all encountered that too. So I talked a little bit before about how opioids, cocaine, and meth, alcohol, they all have different mechanisms and different pharmacology. So the basic building block of the drug addiction is the dopamine, and the dopamine increase different ways depending on the different drugs. So with heroin, opioids, it binds to receptors on one cell, which releases a certain neurotransmitter, and that binds to another cell, and then that leads to the dopamine release. And I'm just saying that just so there's a little bit of understanding that there's different mechanisms, and that's why different drugs have different effects and different treatments, because the different drugs are going to bind to different types of receptors, and so the medication used to treat them are going to have to be different for each different drug. So with methamphetamine, what happens is the meth goes into these are called vesicles here, and it bumps out the dopamine, and it creates an increased dopamine in the cleft. So it directly increases the dopamine for the downstream effects to create the pleasure feeling. Cocaine, on the other hand, and I don't expect anybody to remember this, but just so you understand there's different mechanisms. Cocaine blocks the uptake of dopamine. So dopamine is released, and normally it goes back into these little vesicles. But with cocaine, the cocaine blocks the channel that would allow the dopamine to go back into its cell. So it keeps more dopamine in this area, creating bigger intensity of effect because of the cocaine. Alcohol is extremely complicated in how its effects are. And basically, it affects several different neurotransmitters and several different systems. And, basically it's like you take alcohol and then all this stuff happens and then you get the dopamine. So it's not well understood, and it's extremely complicated. And, of course, the science is always developing. But, that's why if somebody is an opioid addict, an alcoholic, and that Suboxone doesn't do anything for them because it doesn't block the correct receptor that an alcoholic would have blocked, because the alcoholic doesn't care about the opioid receptors. They're caring about what's going on with the different neurotransmitters here. Marijuana also binds to cannabinoid receptors in the brain, which leads to the release of dopamine. And each of the drugs of abuse do lead to this dopamine spike, but they get there in different ways, and that's why different drugs have different feels for people, and people have different, behave differently, act differently, and need to be treated differently. I'm talking now about the changes that happen in the brain because of drug use. And one of the important changes, again, is the change in the limbic system here in this area. The amygdala, again, is memories, feelings. It's mostly feelings, and it's going to create a conditioned response. The hippocampus is the memory area. They're very closely connected. The locus coeruleus here is the alarm center of the brain. So what happens is when somebody is a drug addict and they're getting towards the end of their supply or they're starting to withdraw, the locus coeruleus has a lot of adrenaline that will be released and creates that anxiety that people have who are low on drugs, starting withdrawal, or needing to find drugs. So you see people in that state have a lot of energy. They're panicked. They're willing to do a lot to get to their drug. And they have a lot of energy from that adrenaline release from the locus coeruleus that's creating this panic in their brain. And one of the things that has been shown to happen in addict brains is this D2 receptors are dopamine receptors. So it's called downregulating, which means that basically the receptor disappears because there's too much dopamine. So these receptors go back into the cell and aren't present on the surface of the cell for the dopamine to be present, which is why people have to take more and more drugs, because the receptors aren't present and they can't get the same effects that they had been getting from the dopamine release. On the right, this is probably 10 or 15 years old now, showing this area is the striatum, which is the limbic area of the brain where the amygdala is and the hippocampus. And the red you see are, the red and the yellow show the dopamine receptors. And in the control is the non-addicted brain. And what you see in the addicted brain with in each of the drugs of abuse listed here, cocaine, meth, alcohol, and heroin, is that there is fewer dopamine receptors in that striatum area, which is a kind of a concrete physical representation of what's going on in the dopamine or in the addicted brain. You can see the same thing in gambling addicts, the same thing in folks who are obese, is that this downregulation of the dopamine receptors. And this slide is, again, old, and I'm sure many of you have seen it before, but it's just a very concrete representation of the changes that are going on in the brain. And so I always like to remind my staff that people's brains have changed. They have brain trauma from using the addicted drug. This is showing the D2 receptors over time. So the control, again, is the brain that is of a non-addict. And this is using methamphetamine. So this is the methamphetamine user after 1 month of sobriety. And then after 14 months of sobriety, you can see that the dopamine receptors have started to come back a little. So 14 months, so over a year after they become abstinent, is showing the brain healing. And I really like this slide because just the concept of you have to give the users time to heal, time to be abstinent so that they can heal. And during the first few months when somebody's in the wellness court, and they show up a half an hour late, it's frustrating, but I still give them positive reinforcement for coming because their brain is not in a state of healing at that point. It's really, for about the first 90 days, I believe that folks really aren't taking anything in, and that they may be saying that they understand, but I don't think their brain has healed enough to be able to actually remember things and to take it in, to take in what we're telling them. And so it's why we have court every week. It's why we have them meet with probation a couple times a week and with their case manager a couple times a week, because that's what they need. And we really try to use positive reinforcement over the first 90 days at least. And the things that I tell folks is that, don't lie and don't disappear, and we can work with everything else. And so at 14 months, our program, if somebody does it perfectly, and nobody ever does it perfectly, is 11 months. So probably about 14 months is probably the average for somebody to graduate from our wellness court program. And by then, we're hoping that their brain has healed, and they've started to display, that they can get a job, that they can be on time. And it's about healing from brain trauma, and that's how I like to think of it and how I teach my staff to think about it. So this slide is glucose metabolism. So your brain relies on glucose as its energy source, and that's what's, your brain feeds on. I get hangry. I'm sure many of you have heard about that, being hangry, where we call it low blood sugar. You get cranky because you need to eat. I always try to make sure I have something to eat before I go on the bench, so I'm not cranky, just randomly. Sometimes I'm cranky on purpose, but, so glucose is what your brain is running on. Food gets converted to glucose, and that goes into your brain. So this slide shows the glucose metabolism that's going on in a cocaine addict. And so the yellow, the lit up areas show is the metabolism, is glucose. So that, remember, the top of the brain is going to be the frontal cortex. That's the decision-making part of the brain. So you can see in a control, it's nicely lit up. The red is the most lit up, and the yellow is also a lot of glucose metabolism. So glucose metabolism is showing that the brain is processing stuff. So in a cocaine addict at 10 days sober, there's very little going on. Down here, this is the brain stem area. This is the more primitive brain area, not the thinking brain. The thinking brain is in the front here. And then even at 100 days sober, the glucose metabolism is still lower than in the control. So even 3 months into the sobriety, there's still deficit in brain functioning. And and I show this slide to my staff a lot because it's just so important for them to have this visual that there is a brain deficit with folks who are addicted, even 100 days after they've become sober, that the deficit continues. And there are more and more changes that are being discovered with using drugs of abuse in the brain, and this is going to be updated over time. There's very little research on marijuana, and that's partly because the federal government previously did not allow much marijuana research, but now with many states legalizing marijuana for recreational use and for medicinal marijuana, I'm hoping that we'll see more research on the long-term effects of marijuana, because the slides showing the decreases in the D2 receptor, this doesn't happen with marijuana. It happens with all the other drugs of abuse, but it hasn't been shown to happen with marijuana. And I'm not saying that marijuana doesn't create changes in the brain. It's just there hasn't been anything that's shown that definitively yet. But as more research happens with marijuana use and long-term marijuana use and the use of the more concentrated marijuana, THC, the gummy bears and all that, there should be more good research on what happens or may be happening in the brain. Not that medical marijuana isn't useful for lots of people, but as far as a drug of abuse, it certainly is something that we watch out for. Interestingly, there have been no deaths attributed to overdoses of marijuana. It would take a huge amount of THC to kill somebody. So not that there hasn't been deaths from drunk driving and other harmful effects. And the effects on children, of course, could be devastating. There's also been research this is in cocaine addicts. Well, I think this is just in rats that's been shown that there's an increase in dendrite production. So in a normal brain cell, a normal neuron, the dendrites, have pretty decent spacing. But in a cocaine-addicted rat, at least, there's been an increase in dendrites. So dendrites mean more signaling between neurons, and it may create that kind of nervousness that we often see with cocaine addicts, where they're hyper because they've got more neuronal connections, more neurons happening. And then this is really, kind of a shocking slide showing the volume loss of the brain. So these are brain slices a moderate drinker, and then an alcoholic, showing the huge deficits. And again, the top is going to be the prefrontal cortex, where the thinking part of the brain is. And the volume loss is just profound. And then this slide is showing a normal 43-year-old, meaning, I guess normal meaning just a moderate drinker or a non-drinker. And then the alcoholic brain showing the loss in brain volume. And, we see this kind of loss in brain volume in Alzheimer's disease. And we also see it in the brains of traumatized children. So again, this is showing brain trauma from using drugs of abuse. And the brain trauma, of course, is prevalent throughout the brain, but the important factors for addictive behavior, again, is in the limbic system. And that's, I'm sure you're all aware of, or heard about triggers that folks need to stop going to places where they may be triggered. And that's people, places, and things that are associated by that addict with drug use. So the changes in the brain structure, the hippocampus, again, which is the memory, the amygdala, which creates the emotions and the conditioned response and the craving, the changes in the prefrontal cortex, which the prefrontal cortex is forethought and planning, and then the locus coeruleus, again, which is the alarm center. So you think about it as, your clients or folks in your court who go to the corner store where they've bought drugs before or they've used drugs. So their brain, if they decide that they're going to go to that corner store again, their brain is going to start telling them, oh, yeah, this is important for survival. This is the area where that great thing happened that really helped us survive, remember? And their amygdala is going to be creating the conditioned response of, here you are, this is where you buy drugs. And your hippocampus is going to remember, this is, we felt really awesome here, remember? This is where that great thing happened, and we need it to survive. Your prefrontal cortex is going to be hijacked because it's going to be taken over by the amygdala and hippocampus, and I'll talk about amygdala hijack in a minute. And also your locus coeruleus is going to, start having alarm bells that you need to get the drug in order to survive, and this is where you got it. And it's going to create a lot of energy in the addict to go look for those drugs. We've seen addicts go to tremendous lengths to get their drugs. And, I get frustrated in court when people talk about transportation issues and not being able to get to court. And, I'm kind of flippant, but I do say, if there were free heroin being given away in Espanola, which is, the town 10 miles north of us, I asked them, how long would it take you to, when you were an addict, when you were an active addict, how long would it take you to get to Espanola to get the free heroin? And they acknowledge, yeah, I would get there right away. And so I say, all right, well, you need to use that energy that you would have used when you were seeking drugs to get to court, because if you could figure out how to get to Espanola for free drugs, you can figure out how to get to court so that you can be compliant with your court orders and get here on time, especially when it happens every week. But again, this is a frustration of addicts not having great executive function, not great prefrontal cortex, so that they think on Monday, okay, I need to be in Pojoaque at 2 o'clock tomorrow, and this is how I'm going to get there and make the plan to get the ride. So I'm going to touch a little bit again on trauma. So trauma is something that has been shown to also change the brain. And using a drug of abuse is also a trauma to the brain. And that's kind of the philosophy that I want to keep in mind and have you all keep in mind, is that, addiction, the use of drugs, and trauma are so interlinked, and also probably, the same thing, because using a poison that gets into your brain does create trauma, and having other kinds of trauma in your life also changes the brain. And it decreases the volume of the the brain, of the prefrontal cortex, just like drug abuse. It changes connectivity in the amygdala. So that means that the neurons that are in the amygdala, they are increased. That's the emotional base. People are when they're in trauma, they react without their thinking brain. They use their emotional brain, the limbic system, which is the emotional brain. The fight or flight system is turned on very quickly in folks with trauma. The PTSD, I know you're all familiar with the post-traumatic stress disorder, where people aren't making rational choices with their prefrontal cortex because their emotional aspects are turned on very quickly, and which is almost exactly what's being seen in drug addicts, where their thinking brain is not prevalent. It's their emotional brain, their limbic system. And what we see a lot is these adverse childhood experiences connected to folks who use substances as adults or later in their juvenile years, in their teen years. And this adverse childhood experience is a study that's been going on for many years, a few decades, I believe. So it's evidence-based, and it shows that the more childhood traumas that folks have, there's an increased onset of substance abuse, chronic disease, other kinds of social problems, suicide, and early death. So childhood trauma is directly linked to early death and substance abuse. And people can go online and get what's called their ACE score, their adverse childhood experiences score. And those adverse childhood experiences are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, the mother treated violently, substance abuse in the home as a child, mental illness in the home, divorce or separation, or an incarcerated household member. So if you go through those ACE scores, or those ACE factors with our clients, you'll see that most of our clients are going to have very high ACE scores. And in Native American communities, the ACE score is higher than in the general community, general populations. And there's the more ACE scores you have, the higher the likelihood of having substance abuse issues. And other changes in the brain and linked to trauma is this idea of epigenetics. And epigenetics, it's like above genetics. So it's changes in gene expression and changes in DNA it's changes in what proteins are made that aren't connected to DNA, but it's connected to trauma. So toxic stress, chronic stress, trauma, it remodels the brain by adding these methylation groups or acetylation groups into different genes, and it creates changes in stress response. And it's called epigenetics because it's actually, you can pass it on genetically or pass it on to your children, even though it's not a change in your DNA. So this is been tied to historical trauma. It's been tied to children of Holocaust survivors. It's been tied to children of people who lived through famine, where the children's stress responses are different because of the trauma that their parents have gone through. So think about the folks in your programs, the addicts that you deal with, and you know that the trauma in their lives has stretched back generations. And, so it makes it all the more important to ensure that the cycle is broken and that children can be raised with as little trauma as possible, including the trauma of being in the home with an addict. Not that you should, of course, remove children from homes just because somebody's an addict, but trying to create resiliency in the children and making sure that when we're dealing with our clients, we're keeping in mind that most of them are also parents, and to provide parenting skills and make sure that the children are safe as part of the program that we're working with, because the trauma from the parent is passed down to the child, and the child's trauma, even if that child doesn't end up becoming an addict, can be passed down to their own children too, and it keeps going. So I talked before about what's going on in the amygdala, and this term amygdala hijack has been around for about 20 years, and it's about how the rational brain gets taken over. And we've all experienced this, and you can think about it, how you've experienced it. I've experienced it on the bench, and it can be really embarrassing. And it happens when your emotions just overtake your thinking brain. It's losing your temper and just totally overreacting beyond the stimulus, where that person is basically the last straw, and now you've lost it, and you lose it, and you start yelling, or you storm out, you slam your door. And it's about being triggered, and something happens that triggers your fight, flight, or freeze, which is, something that humans have used as a survival mechanism. So you see something, or you hear something, or you smell something that raises your hackles, and your executive function, your prefrontal cortex is shut down, and your reaction from your body is coming directly from your amygdala, directly from your emotional center, and not from your thinking center. And the way to overcome an amygdala hijack is to breathe, to pause. On my bench I have a sign that says breathe, and that has saved me a few times from losing my temper. Or I spin around, I take a breath, I spin back around, because nothing's worth losing your temper. But I don't have a traumatized brain. I don't have an addicted brain. I'm lucky enough never to have dealt with that. And even I lose my temper. I get my amygdala is hijacked regularly. But I'm able to breathe and get out of it and give enough time for my prefrontal cortex to come back online. So, but in an addicted brain, we see that hijacking a lot, and we see that with the behavior, the strange behavior that we see sometimes from addicts. It's strange in the sense of, that as a non-addict, I can't understand why they're suddenly yelling or storming out or what's triggered them. And we see that also with folks who are traumatized, who are non-addicts, that they're going to potentially react with an amygdala hijack because the trauma, they were triggered by something that we may not be aware of at all. So it's important to understand that the folks may be dealing with something that doesn't seem rational at all to us, and it's not rational to the person who's reacting that way either. It's just they are not rational. Their amygdala has taken over. Their more primitive brain has taken over, and they're in a fight, flight, or freeze situation. And so it's important for us not to, to kind of back off and let them have the space to let their rational brain take back over. So I'm going to switch a little bit now to treatment and what may work with different populations. There is evidence of some things that work, but there's very little evidence that much works. In my court, we want to use evidence-based treatments, and so I look to see what's evidence-based, and I try to use that. But the reality is that different things are going to work with different people, and we don't give up on our clients. If somebody tries something and it doesn't work, we try something else. And it may be that we end up going back to the first thing we tried eventually, but we just keep trying different things because there's not a lot of great evidence of specific treatment programs. Because if there were, we would all be using it. There's no great evidence that 12 steps alone works. There's evidence that social activities work, and 12-step programs are good social activities. So to be effective, treatment has to address the individual's drug abuse and any associated medical, psychological, social, vocational, and legal problems. And we know that our clients have all these. Almost all of the addicts in my court have medical problems, have psychological problems, social problems, vocational problems, and they have legal problems because they're in court. That's why they're here. And so trying to get the services to address all of those, we get folks into GED programs, we get folks psychological evaluations, we get them into job skills programs. So they have to, but the problem is that's a lot of working parts. And it's a lot of meetings, and it's a lot of things for addicts to do. We don't try to push any of this stuff on them until they've been at least 3 months sober, because the first 3 months, we have them focus on getting sober and getting up with treatment, getting into treatment and working with people, and also maybe getting a psychological evaluation and seeing what else is going on potentially. And then treatment also has to take into account people's gender. What works with men doesn't necessarily work with women. Their ethnicity, their culture. Here in Pojoaque, in our wellness court, we do try to bring in traditional activities to kind of try to tie that into folks, into their treatment. And some people want to go do traditional medicine, and that's fine. We try to figure out what's going to work with people. And unfortunately, only a small percent of addicts actually receive any evidence-based treatment at all. A lot of times they're just sent to AA meetings, which on its own has not been shown to be an effective treatment. Certainly as part of a treatment, it's effective for lots of people. And, many, many people have gotten sober just by going to AA. And again, part of the problem is that nothing is going to work for everyone. And it's important to figure out for each individual what works for them. People just have to be treated as individuals with all of their baggage and all of what they do have, all their positive traits too, and try to figure out what that is and exploit those. I just want to kind of emphasize that judges, we're not medical doctors. A few of us may be, and I'm a doctor of science, but I'm not a medical doctor, and we're not psychologists, and we're not substance abuse counselors. So you're on the bench, and I've been reading a lot about certain drug courts that require specific medications. I particularly heard about some courts requiring that folks get on Vivitrol, and we'll talk about the medication-assisted treatment in a moment. But we're not medical doctors. I see somebody who's an opioid addict, and I believe that they probably would do better if they're on Suboxone or on methadone or on naltrexone. And I, tell them they need to go to their doctor and see if that works for them. I don't say you need to get on Suboxone. I say you have to go see your doctor and see if that is something that would work for you. Or I believe that somebody might have a co-occurring disorder, so I send them to a therapist to see or get a psychological assessment, because I can't do that. And I'm not a substance use counselor. I can't sit on the bench and say, okay, you have to go to 2 more AA meetings, unless that's what the substance use counselor told me would work for them, because I don't have that training. And it's just kind of a caution, because there are, unfortunately, judges who either don't allow medically assisted treatment or prescribe certain medication-assisted treatment and not others. So what works? And I do want to open this up to folks who are listening, because there's a 90% relapse rate for opioids and methamphetamine, and we're at a time where it's a crisis, and we really need to think in original ways, come together as a community and figure out what works best and try to get some really ideas of what's working. And, as I said before, in my court, I try to use evidence-based treatment, but I think the community also has to have a say in what works for the community, and also individually, because different things work for different people. So if you have any particularly great ideas for things that are working, I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing here. But there's with the different drugs of abuse, and of course many people use more than one drug, so there's probably substance abuses. Here we see a lot of people who are primarily opioid addicts who also use alcohol and also use methamphetamine. And we've also been seeing a lot of people using gabapentin, which is a often prescribed drug for nerve pain and for seizures, but we're seeing many folks abuse that too, and unfortunately we don't have a drug test for it yet. So we're, it's something we can only catch if the person admits to it or we find out that they have a prescription. So for opioid addicts, the only thing so far that has been shown to work is using medication-assisted treatment, Suboxone and methadone, with counseling. So that's the standard of care. And Suboxone and methadone are relapse prevention medication, and that's how it really should be thought of, as relapse prevention. There's a lot of negative thoughts about methadone and buprenorphine because they do act on the opioid receptor and can be abused if they're misused. Methadone, of course, people have to go to clinics and get their dose. With buprenorphine, folks generally are able to get a 1-week prescription at the beginning. We control their medication, for their buprenorphine medication in the court I work for. We do keep it in our safe, and we dispense it ourselves at the beginning until people have shown that we can trust them and it won't be diverted into the black market or into the street drugs. Here in northern New Mexico, buprenorphine is readily available on the street, unfortunately. People use it as a relapse prevention medication. They self-medicate with Suboxone to prevent withdrawal. So when people are using it as prescribed, it is a relapse prevention. It prevents them from having all the negative consequences of drug use, the drug seeking, the anxiety that's associated with drug seeking, with going into withdrawal, the loss of work. People are able to go to work for the first time. We've seen remarkable turnarounds with folks on Suboxone and methadone because it takes away that anxiety that addicts have when they don't know where their next dose is coming from. If they know that they're not going to go into withdrawal, then they have a remarkable ability to live their lives in a productive way. And this, of course, is not perfect because people still relapse onto heroin and other opioids even if they're on medically prescribed buprenorphine. Nothing is a magic bullet. Nothing's been shown to be a magic bullet. It's just this is one thing that is evidence-based and has been shown to work for opioid addicts. And then the pharmacology of those drugs. So an agonist is something that activates the receptors. So methadone creates the dopamine spike, as does buprenorphine. Buprenorphine is a less of an agonist, meaning it creates less of an effect than methadone, but it prevents so if somebody's on Suboxone and they take another opioid, there's not going to be much of an effect because the receptors are already occupied by the Suboxone or the methadone. The methadone is very long-lasting, and that's one of the benefits. It lasts 24 hours, so they take their dose, they get there's a slow dopamine release, but the receptors are occupied, so taking another opioid on top of it isn't going to work. We see people abusing it by using other drugs on top of the opioid, like Valium type drug, a benzodiazepam, which has a different mechanism and creates dopamine spikes in a different way. So it's not acting on the opioid pathway, but a different pathway. And so we know that people abuse these drugs, but we also know that if they're on Suboxone or methadone, it helps with that drug-seeking behavior, and it gives them the space to deal with treatment. And then at the bottom is naloxone, which is an antagonist, and so that completely blocks the dopamine release from the opioid receptor. Naloxone is also known as Narcan, and that's what many first responders are now using to prevent drug overdoses. Okay, and then, so this is the three main medication-assisted treatments are methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone, which is also the Vivitrol. And we use naltrexone also for alcohol addicts, and it has worked really well for that. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just wrap up. Again, Vivitrol is the antagonist. This is a 30-day shot that folks take, and it blocks the receptors for 30 days. Again, this is something that there's a danger if folks come off the Vivitrol and then use their opioid at the same level as when they first started, as before they used the Vivitrol, so it may lead to overdoses. This is a study that shows, this is using rats, but it's somewhat valid for addicts too, is that basically having positive social sober activities decreases addiction, and that's something that really needs to be focused on, is creating space away from substances with sober folks, and a lot of good social and family connections that are positive helps addicts tremendously. And just lastly, for me, one thing we're doing in Pojoaque is we just got funding to get a courthouse facility dog, which helps folks in trauma and addicts connect better with services and with service providers. So we are in the process now of meeting dogs, and we'll be getting a dog hopefully in the next 6 months. And that's my email address, so feel free to email me anything. And now I think we're going to open it up for any questions that may be out there. So just type into the chat box if you have any questions. And the other thing that we have going on here is we just started a sober living program. Right now it's very small. We have 2 apartments, one for men, one for women. We could serve up to 4 people each. We have a question from Terry. It says, since relapse is so prevalent, do most of you measure time to relapse to show success for a program? We haven't measured time to relapse. We look at recidivism. So even if somebody after our wellness court program, if they use again, that's certainly a relapse. But if they say they're an alcoholic and they drink, but they're just drinking at home and they haven't committed another DUI, then that's what we're measuring in our program. So, but that's a good question. So with our sober living facility, we don't know if it works yet. It's a lot of work, especially with opioid addicts. It's very difficult. Unfortunately, we found needles in our sober living facility, and we found other drugs, and those, if we know who brought them in, those people are immediately expelled, of course, because they're endangering the sobriety of other people in that program. But we're really hoping to learn a lot from it and to be able to provide stable living. Okay, so the judges aren't doctors. As judge, when you send individuals for assessments into doctors, how do you get the information back related to any drug prescribed? Well, we tell people they need to sign releases if there's So we have people sign releases, and we do that by court order, that they have to sign a release for any related drug prescription. If somebody's going and getting a prescription for something that's not a medication-assisted treatment, then that's their business, as long as it's not something that's a drug of abuse. We try to give people as much privacy as possible. There's Minnesota with the waiting list. It's very, we used to have that problem here in northern New Mexico, unfortunately, but we do have more accessibility now than we did just a year ago. we've been able to get people into Suboxone programs much quicker than we used to be able to. And then asked, do we have parents who've had their children removed from their home because of substance abuse and not been charged with a crime participate in your program? Yes, we do. We get referrals from social services, and so they're required to complete the program. And they're required to submit to the jurisdiction of the court, meaning that if a jail sanction, which I rarely use, but I do like to have it as a possibility, that they have to submit to being the jurisdiction for jailing for sanctions under the wellness court model. And we also have volunteers. We have folks in the community who voluntarily come forward and want to participate without a social services interaction or without any criminal interaction. And we've had 3 people in the last year come forward and volunteer and have done very successfully and done really well. Okay, Maris Obi is talking about mindfulness techniques. That's a really great idea, and I was just talking with somebody about that recently. And with the spirituality and traditional healers helping, yeah. And then Marlon Miner is asking how many participants we usually have in the Healing to Wellness program one time. And so if you guys want to answer these questions too, that'd be great. But right now, my program is we have about 25 people in the program, and that's at all different kinds of phases. So usually we have about 15 or 16 people who show up every week, depending on what phase they're in. And we have some participants who are in residential treatment also, so they're counted as being in the program, but obviously they're not actively participating right now. And we actually just graduated 3 people yesterday, so we had a big celebration with that. And Ralph Jefferson's asking for research articles explaining the genetic connection, and we can add those later, I think. Is that right, Ansley? Or Jessica? The methadone with the positive drug court, yeah. We do, we have actually, the substance use counselor that works for me also works in a methadone clinic. So we have a lot of clients in common, actually. So I was lucky enough that Pojoaque actually hired a substance use counselor to be housed here in the courthouse. And she's a LADAC, so that was very helpful for us to be able to get that. And it's been very helpful for our program to have a substance use counselor who's right in the courthouse. All right, so we have, and then we also have our coordinator and our probation officer, and they're all housed in the courthouse, and that seems to be very helpful to get all the services to everybody. All right, I think Ansley's going to come on because we're about to wrap up. If anybody has any last questions, please feel free to type in.
Thank you, Judge McGinnis, for that very interesting and informative presentation. And so before we conclude, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about NIJA and our work in tribal communities. As some of you already know, NIJA is a tribal justice professional organization, and our goal is to build tribal court capacity. We do a pretty broad range of work for tribal communities, including training and technical assistance to support judges and judicial personnel, but we're also TA providers for the Bureau of Justice Assistance Program Area 3 grantees. And another big part of our work is the Tribal Access to Justice Innovation website. So this website, it allows us to highlight and share different programs in tribal communities, and it helps tribal justice practitioners learn about promising practices in Indian country. So if you know of a promising program, let us know about it. And if it's not already highlighted on our website, we can shine a light on that program and share it with the community. And that website is tribaljustice.org. And again, our goal with it is to learn about emerging practices in Indian country and share that information, as many tribes are addressing common challenges. So that concludes our webinar. My email address is ansley@nija.org if anyone has any questions or TA requests. Otherwise, thank you, Judge McGinnis, for your presentation, and Jessica and NCJFCJ for hosting. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. All right, thank you.